Awesome.
Computer. There we go. All right, go ahead.
Great. So basically the goal of today is we're going to do a really simple 3D illustration. Usually in my workflow, I tend to use a mix of Cinema 4D for modeling, which is a popular 3D modeling software, and also Illustrator and Dimension. But today, just for the sake of simplicity and just so that everyone who has Adobe products that you can just jump right in, we're going to do all of our modeling in Dimension and just use really basic primitive shapes. So just like to get a little familiar with this interface, it's kind of like at first feels like very open, blank canvas kind of thing. I think the main thing to think about is like when you're used to working in 2D and you move to 3D, there's a few funny things that you have to keep in mind as you're working. A big one is this camera, right? Because this is the way that you're framing the scene, but also if you want to get different angles when you're doing your renders later, it's important to just make sure that you also look around the scene, but first get your camera set up. So you're kind of like setting your frame here. I'm going to just change my canvas size to just a square canvas. I'll just do 1,000 by 1,000 pixels and then frame that up. So just like Illustrator or anything, it's kind of like your artboard. And then we'll grab this camera. And if you notice there's like a slight rotation on this camera, you might not see it right away, but you will notice it later. I'm just going to frame everything up so it's nice and ready to go. And when I bring things into my scene, they will just be aligned. So if you notice, it's like we just, ooh, all right, that's good. Good start. We are crashing. Let's start again. All right. Well, it wouldn't be a live demo if something didn't go wrong, right? All right, let's try this again.
My Dimension just crashed as well, so I'm just gonna watch.
It crashed as well. Oh
yeah,
my gosh.
literally.
Yeah, it can. That's hilarious. I've actually never had a crash on me before, so this is exciting times for me.
I think my MacBook isn't powerful enough for Dimension. So that's fine.
It can be a little bit intensive, but the nice thing is compared to a lot of 3D softwares, the rendering is really there's two things I'll show at the end, but the rendering is much more compatible than other 3D programs, which is great for MacBooks specifically, which is super handy because I don't know if anyone's ever used Cinema 4D, but it can be a little bit of a nightmare.
Right.
Okay,
I'm just gonna be a silent spectator then because it doesn't want me to. I can't play along. I can't do it. Yeah. Oh no. Just crashing.
Okay. Well,
it's all good.
Hopefully we can do this later, and then hopefully it'll work. Maybe it's just Zoom and everything is a bit too much. I'm going to bring up my camera 100 because I kind of like things to be floating a little bit in this scene. Let's see if it behaves now. Okay, seems like so far we have our scene set up. Great. The environment is another thing to start off with. So you have a lot of things here, and just with the interface, like I really believe, just start slowly, just start making some stuff. There's a lot of great default basic shapes and stuff that you can get started with without jumping right into all the complex stuff. So we'll start with a background, and I'll just pull in my image that I just did a quick sketch in, here, let's grab it, the sky, just in Procreate, and that's handy because I can just use it as a reference, like you would maybe trace something in Illustrator. Again, very simple. Oops, 0.3 please. There we go. And then, so I'm going to start off with some really basic shapes. So essentially, modeling Dimension is kind of like playing with building blocks. You have like a lot of basic stock that it comes with out of the box. You can also get a lot off Adobe stock if you have a subscription. But I'm just going to use primitive shapes right now to get started. Oops, I always do this. So basically, if you notice, I can't actually see this. Oh, sorry, before I jump into that, one more thing. The camera. So because I've framed up my scene, I like this framing. It's good for me. I'm going to add this camera bookmark. And the reason that you do this is because when you're looking around your scene, if I want to find other things that are in my scene, I need to be able to move my camera around because there's like a lot of space here. And then it's kind of hard to just get back to what you were just at. So if you have a saved bookmark, then you can just snap back to that, which is really helpful as you're working around your scene. So just starting with this rounded cube, if I can find it. Let's say that maybe it's just not big enough right now. And it says a 0, 0, 0, but I don't see it yet. So where did it go on me? Maybe let's just make it really big so I can find it. 100, 100, 100. There it is. We're just too close. So we're going to zoom out a little bit here. It's a bit confusing and disorienting sometimes when you first start working with 3D, but let's move back about 100. Maybe that's good. And then we'll get this cube down to a bit of a smaller size so that we can see it. All right, and maybe even further back. Where's our cube down? There we go. Okay, I'm gonna save this actually as my default because that's gonna be just easier as we bring things in. So again, I can just, oops. Sometimes you move things around too much. If I move back a bit more, there we go. So now we're good. I'm gonna just update this as my new default. So this is my new default camera view. I have my nice rounded cube. So I'm gonna make the depth of this, I don't know, like let's say like 5, and the height is going to be quite high. Let's say it's 40. Maybe we'll make it bigger. And then the Z-index as well, 40. Oops. And then here, I think the nice thing is too, so there's 2 ways that you can handle resizing things. You can enter the numbers in there, or maybe more intuitively for people who understand Illustrator and that sort of thing, you can just resize it really simply within the viewport. So if you think about it like in Illustrator or something like that, you are dealing with sort of like resizing parameters. So if you hit S, it allows you to pull and resize things as you go. But the reason I do a mix of both, because you want to kind of keep an eye on these numbers, because sometimes it can be tricky for how you align things later. So if you kind of want to keep an eye on the sizing, not just how it looks within the frame, but also like how it actually is. Because if I go like I like this and I have this framed up and I go check around what is the actual width of this, I'm happy with that. But you might discover that it's actually, oh, it's a lot like wider than I expected it to be, or a lot, oh man, I just reset my camera again. Didn't get here. Let's put that back. And we're just gonna move this over here. And great, so this is again like a little bit more the tedious part of Dimension or any sort of 3D modeling, is like, cool, you have your great idea, but the actual building blocks part kind of takes time. So I'm going to go through some of these primitive shapes, and then afterwards I might just leap ahead just in the interest of time so that we don't take all of our time just watching me make things out of blocks. And feel free to ask any questions as we go. We're probably just going to model for just a few minutes here. So if I break any shape down, so I have like this browser here, so that's my cube, and then I'm like, okay, what do I want to use to create this sort of this URL bar here? Again, you get all these amazing shapes out of the box. So I think what I will use is probably actually another rounded cube. That's the other thing that you find out about modeling, is that so many things are just cubes that are modified. Even in 3D modeling software that is more complex, you're still just making things out of cubes a lot of the time. If you notice, I'm changing the pivot, so again, it's like the center from which everything will scale. And a handy thing about Dimension is I can also, just like you're used to for regular Illustrator and stuff, you can do an option click and you will be able to duplicate things, which is great. I'm going to just take the scale down a little bit to get to my browser bar size. And
can I ask a very short question?
Of course, yeah, I'm just chatting away here, so go ahead.
Yeah, while you're doing this, like, please keep going, it's nice. So you're talking a lot about the shapes that you're creating in Dimension. Do you have any way of importing, let's say, vector graphics that you might have from an illustration? Do you use that, and or why not?
Yeah. No, so my normal workflow is that I will actually create a vector illustration, and then I will import that into Cinema 4D and extrude it. So unfortunately, because we're not going to show the Cinema 4D part of it, there's no way to just import, as far as I know, any paths directly into Dimension and then be able to model them. Unfortunately, you generally need some sort of intermediate step. And in my case, that's usually Cinema 4D. So I'll take that like path, and then I would extrude in there. So there is another basically that's about it. But by default, like you're kind of dealing with, I guess I didn't say this properly. You're kind of dealing with you're a bit limited in some ways in what you're able to do within Dimension itself. So you're really just playing with the building blocks here. I just need to keep updating my camera by accident, and then here. Okay. So, but it's a really good question, because it's definitely can be frustrating, but it's actually pretty amazing. There's a great group that I can link to you later that has a bunch of people, they call themselves the Dimension Enthusiasts, and they have this really, really terrific community where they they create incredible stuff just using really the simple shapes that are available. They can create all sorts of characters, and you can really explore what you're doing there. So another thing that's kind of helpful when you're keeping in mind with this, there is an alignment tool within Dimension. It's a little bit trickier to use than maybe other ones. But essentially, you are able to align, say I wanted to align this to the center of this cube or whatever, then I can do that. It's not, I don't find it the most intuitive, to be honest. I tend to just either calculate, so I'll take like a specific, I'll figure out what the number is that I want and then calculate it, or I will just eyeball it, which I know is not ideal. But you can get quite specific with it if you need to. But as you can see too, it's going to show me exactly like how many centimeters I'm dragging something out. But it doesn't really have the same level of, or at least I haven't played around with it enough to get all the different details in terms of like getting alignment really perfect. But it will help you part of the way. And the other thing is all this data is available to you, so you can always take a look and just make sure, okay, that everything is at the same y-axis and that sort of thing, which can be a little tedious. Or you can try the alignment tool. So does anyone else have any immediate questions? I know this can be like a bit of an intense interface. Like, how do people feel about it so far?
I was just wondering if you can, if there's like a layer overview. Is that the scene?
Yeah.
Is there where you can turn off things and, for example, turn off the big cube so you can see the sketch again?
Exactly. Yeah. So because I'll be better. So here I will say this is the URL. I will start naming my layers, which is always good. I got some extra spheres in here. Did I? 1, 2. Yeah, I got an extra one. Yeah, and you can group things as well, which is handy. So if I select these 3 spheres, let's say, then I can group them together if it will behave. Again, can be a little tricky. There we go. So group. And then so it's handy for organizing your layers, which is really helpful later as you're starting to add materials to everything. It's very important. So we'll call these buttons. And I'm just going to scale this down a little bit. I'm like quite finicky about this stuff. I really, I tend to play around a lot with this as I go. and eyeball it. And I'll just put this together as one big group. And I'm happy to show more modeling if people are interested, but I think that kind of gives you the basics of like really what it is. Do you want me to jump ahead and I can show you now more material stuff and other aspects of Dimension? Because there's a lot we can talk about it. Yeah? Okay, cool. So yeah, otherwise it would be just me being finicky for a while.
Also fun.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I have another one set up. I think it's this one that's all ready. This is the art attack moment. Ready? Boom. Ah, amazing. All modeled. I love it. And so yeah, that would be eventually, obviously it wasn't quite exact the same, but the idea is that you would eventually have this. And then we get to do what I think is one of the most fun part, which is the materials and colors and textures. Right. And this is like really where 3D comes alive in a different way.
Just a quick question. Yeah. Can you tell us what the the primitive shape of the mountains and the little girl is?
Yeah. So if you look at this, this is just it's a cone, and actually that's a really good point. So there's another thing that you can do is you can start to play around with the radiuses. So like this is how you can take really basic shapes and make them much more interesting. So this is literally just a cone that has been, I've added a radius to it, the top radius. So if I go 0, it'll just be pointy again. But actually I kind of like the look of that. Maybe we can keep the points. Oh well, that's fine. So the radius, and then the bevel is also key. So if you look at the bevel, it's going to give you that kind of smooth shape that makes it look a little bit more organic. And a little bit more interesting than just the regular primitive. So that's really, I think Dimension, like it gives you a lot of basics, but actually with those basics, you can really go really far if you're willing to tweak things and play around with it. You can even slice them. So you can create some really interesting shapes if you start to like mess around with it. I don't know why it's not showing. Maybe it's all the other side. Yeah, so if you can see, I can like create some cool like half shapes or whatever. So that's really handy when you're starting to put things together. And then for the girl,
how you would, this is how you would go if you want to like Boolean something. You would kind of just start. You wouldn't merge them. You would just start slicing them.
Yeah. So there, as far as I know, there's no like any sort of like union tool in Dimension yet. I think that they're working on some stuff like that. But right now, so yeah, if you wanted to combine two different shapes, you could either. The nice thing is too with this girl, like the way that the shapes meld together is actually quite nice. I actually really like it. So if you notice, like this girl is literally just a rounded cube, and then a circle, and then a half circle or half, like I forgot what they call it, but so it's very again very simple shapes. And in a way, it kind of like forces you to be creative in how you put your shapes together. Let me go back to the default. Yeah, no, thank you. All right, so we can play around with some color. So I'm going to start with a background. I really love, so for this environment, you have this nice background that you can add. I like to add a gradient. So I prepared these in Illustrator. I was playing around with some like fun little extra gradient shapes, but I actually realized that I like this just basic gradient after all. I have my palette here, so I'm ready to go. But so for this one, I'm going to just use just a really simple yellow gradient that I have prepared. There we go. Yeah, that's the basic one. And you just throw it in there. And then it's nice because it really starts to add already this feeling of Dimension into your work. And also I'd recommend, so this is like the backtick key, or is a really helpful shortcut where you can test your render. And this is something that you're going to be doing a lot as you start to figure out the materials and what looks good and what doesn't, because what you're seeing in your viewport is not what you're going to see in the final image. So you have to kind of go back and forth. But again, with this, the nice thing is that it's pretty compatible with Mac compared to other software. So let's get started with some colors. So I have so many different types of materials I can use here. Like there's these amazing substance materials that are like great defaults. So just by selecting them, You can get some cool like textures in there. And again, I won't go too deep into it because we could just talk about this forever, but there's a lot of cool customization that you can add within each of these basic materials that it comes out of the box with, that you can start to really create some cool custom looking materials without having to know too much about like Substance Painter and stuff like that. So there's a lot you can do just out of the box here. So you can make it look really awesome if you want to. I'm going to stick pretty basic for this just so that we have time and we don't have to think about it too much. So if I go to, so I'm going to stick with this kind of glossy paper for a bunch of my bases, and then I'm going to play around with the color for each one. So if you go to, so I have my palette here, which is handy. I'm just going to grab, let's say that this one is going to just be the basic kind of off-white color that I was going to use. So this is great. Your colors are saved. It's kind of like Procreate where your colors will be saved as you go along. And then there's another really cool feature that I wanted to show you quickly. Let's say this is also, trying to remember what I did last time because it worked out for colors. I think, let's say that this one is white as well. So if I take this cylinder and I use my eyedropper tool, which is and I select it, the cool thing about this is that if I have a bunch of different, like if I have a complex illustration, I have a bunch of different materials, or one material that's used for a bunch of different elements. What I can do is actually, you notice this is linked. So I can play with the roughness of this and it will affect all of the ones that are linked together. I can play with the color and the shade of it. So it'll affect, I don't know if you wanted to do this yellow, it'll affect everything, which is super handy if you're trying to recolor an illustration quickly, or you want to test out a bunch of different styles, because it's almost like, especially for UI designers, I think this is pretty familiar. It's like just this idea that once you have your basic palette and all your elements and you know kind of how everything wants to go, if you want to change your theme, it's pretty easy to change the theme of whatever you're doing. For this background, I'm going to start to use, maybe let's try, we could do anything. There's so many options. You can have like cool marble, but I'm going to keep it pretty simple again, just for the sake of, yeah, isn't it wild? Like, it's so nice. You can just drop that in and it's like, oh, that's super interesting. I'm just going to stick with diagonal concrete. Very exciting, but it adds like a nice sort of layer of texture without being overly pronounced. And I can play around with the parameters here again if I want to add a little bit more variation. So if you see like this dirtiness adds some interesting textures in that weren't there before, maybe that gives me more of a marble look or whatever, but I'm going to just keep it pretty simple for now. We'll maybe add a bit of crumple, and I'll grab my colors. And so grab this. Is everyone following along so far? Is there anything that like is very confusing or seems to be weird about this workflow so far, or feels?
Can you use more than one material, or does it only have to be one?
You can use as many as you want. So yeah, they're super customizable. The other cool thing is for some of the materials, so let's say I go with this one and say I want to add, I don't know, cedar or something like that. So let's, for whatever reason, which looks kind of cool. For some of the materials, they will actually have a, which ones have this? They will have an image that they're using as the base of the color, or the base of the material, which you can also update. The other part about that is so that you can, so say I like choose something that has this, where I don't know which one does. I always forget which one has an image as the base of it. I think this one does. So this one's like a sort of mosaic-y color thing. So you see, yeah, here we go. So this is an image actually. And the cool thing is like, say I wanted to, I wanted a glass texture, but I wanted to use a different style of mosaic or something like that. If I double click on this, it'll open up Photoshop, which it is, but it's very, very slow. And essentially I can tweak the image, the base image of it. So if I'm like, oh, you know what, like I like this sort of like overall cool transparent look, but I actually don't really want to deal with, I don't know, I don't want to deal, like it's kind of wild the way it does that. But I don't want to deal with like the colors or the whatever about this image I don't like. I want to swap it out for something else. You can swap it out for whatever you want. So it's kind of, again, you're building on top of already these really great default materials, and then you can really customize it as much as you want. It's going to be a bit slow to render, but already looks kind of cool. We could do like a wild version of this, so we can play around. Maybe we can break outside of our.
Which hotkey did you use for the render?
Oh, it's the backtick. So if you go under your delete button, the backtick one will give you that. Okay, cool. So that kind of gives you a first sense of like what it's like to play around with colors. Again, I just like, I often what I'll do is I'll try and keep with a lot of variety and options comes great responsibility as a designer. You can really go wild with this, but because you're working in 3D space, because you're now not just using the elements of like 2D elements of like color, gradient, whatever, like you're dealing with lighting and a lot more variables that are going to affect the way that you will see the final image. I think it's better to start minimal and then build up from there. It's just a recommendation. You can follow it or not. But because you'll always be surprised by how texture is going to really influence the busyness or the weight of certain elements in your composition. Actually, I have more of these in here. This one's my full palette. So yeah, and is there any other things with materials that, I guess maybe if we look also quickly, just, I was going to use these, but say this one that's glass. This is like a cool thing about 3D materials, right? So when you think of glass, we're thinking about how light travels through it and it creates like, and the transparency of it and certain elements. But it's going to be really slow to render, but essentially these are great things to think about that you can play with to tweak the way that the light is refracting inside of the glass element. So if you're trying to do something realistic, or say you have like a semi-opaque glass, it's kind of like you can start thinking of the physics of it. You don't have to, but the roughness of that glass is going to affect the way that light travels through it. So if it's rougher, it actually won't travel as far through. And it'll create a bit more of it'll look more opaque. So it's kind of a useful, kind of cool things to think about because you're thinking about light and the way things travel through and all of that. So again, just because we are a little short on time, I'm going to pull another art attack moment. I know that we're hopping around a lot, but I think that there's a lot of cool things that I wanted to talk to you about. And I think this next one is the one that's fully, sure we'll save that.
I have one small question because you didn't set up particularly any lights here yet. Right?
That's the next step. Yeah. So okay. I'm jumping ahead from materials, and then we're moving on into lighting now. What did I want? That's this one. I named them a bit weird, so I'm confusing myself here. Let's see if it'll load this file. Which one is it? It's the material one. We want, bear with me as, oh, is there stuff in the chat? Are people chatting? Oh, cool, awesome, great. I didn't know that people were writing, that's great. This is the browser model is the one that I want. Okay, so again, the fully finished. And this is the thing, right? Like I'm such a big believer in like 3D can be very intimidating just because you have way more things to play with because you're dealing with like depth, the way things interact with each other. And it's almost this concept of dealing with, like how are things calculated and how is light hitting things? And it can feel very, a bit overwhelming sometimes. But I think really Dimension is a super, super friendly way to just get started and just start with the base materials that are there and the lights that are there. And that's what we're going to hop into next. So lighting. So this kind of panel is like where it has all the defaults. And again, you can really, if you have an Adobe stock subscription, there's a lot of other lighting options available. And then again, that here you're going to be wanting to play back and forth between the render and the viewport, because it's going to play very differently. As you can see, you have some very specific setups here. So I do like to use their environment lights that they already have set up. So they kind of simulate these studio environments. So you can really notice a difference in the viewport, unless this is the one I have selected already. You should notice a difference. Let's say low-key lighting. Yeah, so you can see already it looks different in the viewport. It looks radically different when it's rendered, but you can get an idea of the way that shadows are going to be hitting this. And already it looks like just much more interesting because of the way that the light comes into play. They have these cool ones that are more environment-based. So it's like, oh, if you want to set your scene outside, like this is kind of like more of a natural style lighting, that sort of thing. You can think about the rotation of these lights as well. So like essentially all this is taking an image like this, and you can see it has these nice colors, and then you have these panels. So like this is like a 3D image file. So you're thinking of like this wrapping around your scene, and how is the light coming through that? And then it's basically just taking this image and then using it as a guide to the way that the lights are hitting this object. And you can play around with the way it rotates. So you can see, even in the scene, you should be able to see, yeah, you see that the light is coming across. So if I'm like, oh, I want this light to be striking it in a really dramatic way, it might be overblown or whatever, but it's good to just test things out and see what you think. The other thing that's great to look at is the directional lights. So these ones are pretty cool because you can actually move them around in your 3D scene. So that's pretty, if you're familiar with any sort of 3D software, lighting is often done this way, where you're actually, it's almost like having like a physical light in space. Like if you've ever done photography or anything like that, again, you're thinking about how you're filling out like your point of focus, and you're thinking of how you're filling it out. So for this one, you have these directional lights, and again, you can really play with the rotation of these lights. So you can even see that shadow coming across there of my invisible light. And I can change the shape of it. So it'll change the way that it's hitting that. There's so many parameters that you can really get fancy with lighting. You can change the color. So if I wanted like cool, wild mood vibes, I'm gonna go with like a purple light. If you can see, it gives you a totally different look already, just based off of the way that that light has changed. For me, and depending what you want to focus out on and nerd out about, I really like to just keep it simple, because lighting, it's hard to do it really well. It's really hard to do it well. And luckily there's a lot of stuff on the internet that you can get for free. So I also recommend just grabbing that. But some of my favorite lighting setups in this one are I like the key and filter lights. I recommend that. There's also the softbox one, which is over here, which can be quite nice. And I have to remove these directional lights as well, because otherwise it's going to have like weird purple vibes in the scene. So that's another thing to note. If you're like, oh, I love the low-key lighting, but I really want some sort of dramatic spotlight, you can add in a directional light and do that for you. But I'm going to keep it simple for this. And I just I'm quite happy with some of the basic setups. You can colorize this light too, which is kind of cool. So if you have an image again that you're like, oh, I want it to let temperature, whatever, you can really mess around with this as much as you want. If I want it to be like really warm, I'm like, oh, it's a sunny day, that really, really sunny day. Or if I want to cool it down, that's also fine too. So whatever works. Is there any questions about lighting that we want to chat about really quick, or how are you feeling about it? Good with this for now. Bluey kind of lighting. Cool.
Well, one
right,
small question, and maybe I missed it earlier, but is the softness of all these shadows on the objects, is that something you set sort of per light, or because it gets quite complex with multiple lights, I guess? How do you do that?
Yeah. Intensity is part of it, right? So the intensity is going to handle how harsh that lighting is. And then basically this, yeah, so that'll change the softness or harshness of the light. Like if you have direct sunlight, if you think about like a really bright day, the shadows are going to be much sharper, much harsher. And then if you have a little bit more of a cloudy day, you'll get more of that softer look. So it depends on what you want, but then you also lose light. So you have to think about, okay, if I like want a softer light, maybe I need more lights, but I want less intensity overall. So it's just tweaking those parameters. I'm going to remove the color. And this is the last thing I wanted to talk about quickly because it's really cool. So they have like a new cloud version, which is great for some of us with slow computers. So this is great. You only have a certain amount of credits, which is a bit annoying, but the cloud beta is great because you can just send it off and they'll use their render farm to render it for you. So if you're on a tight deadline or whatever, you can just send that off, which is amazing. And the other cool thing is there's different export formats. So you can use PSD or PNG. This is really nice because say you're like, this is actually what I've seen a lot of 3D artists do. I haven't played around with it so much yet, but you can export this into PSD and then any little imperfections or little lighting issues where you want to add more depth or whatever to it, you can play around with that in your exported PSD. So you can get a really, really nice, really crisp looking image at the end. And the other thing I actually forgot to mention, which is pretty cool, is you can play with like focus and depth of focus, which is really nice too, because again, it's going to give you more of that either realistic feel or like non-realistic feel, depending on how you want to do it. So if I look at this camera and I set the focus point, is it going to let me? So if I say my focus point is, let's say this thing, yeah, we'll say this person thing. Perfect. And then I go back to my camera and then you can just change how much it blurs. So it's kind of hard to see, but it gives you that a little bit, like this is pretty dramatic, but you can see that like it's going to focus in on this particular character. And then, so just like you would with a camera in a scene, you can focus on a specific thing. You get that nice, like sort of soft look, a bit more of that depth of field, which will again create a bit more of a realistic look if that's what you're going for, or just more visual interest in the scene. So much to play with, like it's just really, there's a lot. So yeah, this is pretty much it. So essentially after that, I would just render it out and I just click render. And then at the end, you'd have something that looks kind of like, it's just gonna take forever for me to render it. So I will give you, where is my little, there it is. Yeah, so that's kind of what it looks like in the end. Oh, that's my Photoshop file. Okay. Yeah. So if I look at that, I'm like, okay, I want to change this is a tricky part about the 3D aspect is when you render it, it's not always what you want it to be like, and the colors aren't quite right. So I could either take it into Photoshop and mess around with like the levels and really make it as pretty as I want, or I can, yeah, just re-render it and tweak it a bit more, depending on what works for me. So I think that's pretty much it. Is there anything else I can quickly show that anyone's interested in or wants to know more about? Oh, there's one more thing too, which I won't have time to show you, but this is a pretty cool part of Dimension too, is that each of these layers can be exported into its own model, object model, which can then be brought into Arrow, which is like an AR app. So you can create, so I could take this browser and I could export it and I could like put it in the room behind me. So I could demo this cool like 3D interface that I built. That's another like nice bonus feature, but we probably won't get into that. But yeah, any questions?
So the last step from this view is that you click render and basically wait forever and then have a JPEG or whatever, an image file saved on your computer. Yeah, exactly. So yeah, you can choose a PSD or a PNG. I would do both and then you can tweak it as you go. Yeah, so then I can play around with it in here as well. Yeah, that's good to go. Or you can do an Arrow as well. So that's the other way that you can export it, is into a 3D model and then bring that into whatever other software you want. You can do really a lot of different things with 3D models. Yeah. Yeah, so you can also actually export it as a 3D, like 3ds or something.
Yeah, so if I take this card, let's say, the one thing you have to do is like, you have to be mindful of size, which is a bit tricky. So say you want it, because of course, Arrow runs on your phone. So you need to be mindful that like, you don't have these like crazy complex 3D objects. You want to keep it down to little basic building blocks again. So say I can take this browser model, which is just the card with the little buttons and stuff, and I can export it for Arrow. So if you see this, it'll process it and then export it, or I can export it as a model as well. So that's option 2. Yeah, actually, probably for architect people, that you are more familiar with the 3D different types of objects. I think it's an OBJ file that it exports to. Yeah. Cool. All right.
This is really awesome. It's like super cool to see it kind of walk through and actually get to that output that you just showed, which is really nice. I'm curious if for you, when you walk through a process like this, do you end up doing most of your tweaking in the model and with the lighting and with all the stuff that you just showed us, or do you end up being like, okay, you know, I'll just render a rough version and then I'll correct all the colors in Photoshop? How do you go about that?
Yeah, I think for me, I do tweak a lot. My other computer is a bit more powerful, so the render's a bit quicker. It honestly can take, I don't even know, like 15 minutes to render something, which is like like this, depending on what your computer power is like. But say you don't have, like you have limited power, you can also just do some tests, which are also a good idea. So to give you a good sense of what you're making, you can do that whole, like the little live view, which will give you, if you wait like maybe, I don't know, 30, 45 seconds, it'll slowly load, and you can kind of get the sense of like, okay, I don't really like how harsh the shadow is, or I really don't like this or whatever. So you can get a sort of fairly interactive understanding of what it'll look like. Or you can also, in your render, you can do a quick low fast render. So I can go like here and locally, let's say I'll render this out, and then it'll calculate that, and so you can get a rough view. And so yeah, when I'm usually working on stuff, it depends on timeline, but also like the power of my computer. But I tend to try and just visualize as much as possible before I actually hit render, because of course that's the most time intensive part of the process. Well, relatively. It can be. Yeah, see, my computer's quite slow. It's an old Mac. But that's pretty much it. Should I stop sharing and we can chat?
Sure. Yeah, awesome stuff.
Awesome.
Let me also stop the recording. Bye.